The electric grid is fundamental to our lives and our country's existence. Without electricity, medicines expire, banks shut down, food goes bad, sewage and water plants don't function. Chaos ensues, and our security is compromised. It is our very reliance on this infrastructure that makes it an obvious target for attack. We know that many of our adversaries, from terrorist groups to nation states, have and continue to develop capabilities that would allow them to attack and destroy our grid at a time of their choosing. One significant threat to the grid is the threat of a physical event that could come in the form of a natural or man-made electromagnetic pulse, known as EMP. The potentially devastating effects of an EMP to the grid are well documented.
It is a lifeline to so much of our economic life, and actually life period in this country. And the vulnerabilities have to be recognized up front. We can't be embarrassed about them. We have to work with one another to try and solve this very urgent problem.
Intelligence suggests that countries seek or have developed weapons capable of destroying our grid. A congressional commission says that our grid and the critical infrastructure that relies on the grid is not adequately protected. Now is the time to act to secure the electric grid, not after a major incident has occurred.
The key to sustainable security is that government and industry identify and address evolving threats against our country together. As our society becomes more and more reliant on technological advances, we actually become more and more vulnerable to debilitating attack.
I want to highlight that in April 21st, 2009, a study by the National Academy of Scientists found that the U.S. could suffer $1 to $2 trillion in damage as a result of EMP, and it would take 4 to 10 years to fully recover.
The grid is one of our greatest strengths, but if not properly protected, it could become one of our greatest weaknesses. More than any other technology, the grid is the long pole in the tent of America's economy and national security. All of our nation's critical systems depend on the grid. I assure you the vulnerabilities of the grid are every bit as urgent as the weaknesses in transportation security that were so tragically revealed by the events of September 11th. A coordinated attack on the grid could literally shut down the U.S. economy, putting lives at risk and costing tens of billions of dollars. Moreover, unlike a storm knocking out power lines that can be replaced in a matter of days, an attack on the grid could result in damage requiring months or years to fix.
Very few people still really understand how grave and imminent the EMP threat is, or that there's a readily actionable plan that is inexpensive and at hand, and that it just takes political will at this point to get it done. We need to educate the people on that, and that's one of EMPact America's missions. The Niagara Conference was a historic event, both because of who spoke and who attended.
Many of the principal government figures, members of the EMP Commission, other scientists, admirals, congressmen, and others came and talked about this. Not one of them had to be paid. They all came and gave their time in order to go ahead and explain to the American people about what was going to happen.
The idea that this is some science fiction that has no basis in reality denies and defies what a bipartisan EMP commission agreed that it did represent, and that is a serious threat to the safety and security of every single American.
Each of you, by being here, is helping to address a vital, important, critical threat to the United States, electromagnetic pulse. What's needed is recognition of the threat and action to avert it.
It's not a secret. You can't, in this society, do anything about something that's this broad in impact and still secret. So in order to get anything done, you actually have to acknowledge that we have a weakness. And we worried about the fact that if we acknowledge that we have a weakness, how damaging will that be to we will inform our adversaries. We came to the conclusion that our adversaries were really quite well informed already.
I've believed for a long time that EMP, or electromagnetic pulse, may be the greatest strategic threat we face, because without adequate preparation, its impact would be so horrifying that we would, in fact, basically lose our civilization in a matter of seconds.
The chair of the EMP Commission, which I was pleased to have set up nearly a decade ago now, says that this would be like a giant time machine that would move you back. And I first said a century in technology. He said no, more than a century in technology.
Somebody early on said it would throw us back into the 19th century. No. It would throw us into an experience for which there is no precedent, because as someone else said, we don't have the stuff and the infrastructure around to run the 19th century. It's all in the Smithsonian or gone.
An electromagnetic pulse, or an EMP, is a super energetic radio wave that's immediately harmless to people, but can burn out all the critical electronic systems that sustain human economic activity and ultimately human life across vast areas, including the entire continental United States. An electromagnetic pulse can be caused by a nuclear weapon detonated at high altitude in outer space, or by a geomagnetic storm caused by a solar flare. Either of these would have continent-wide effects that could cause a blackout across the whole of the United States that could last for a protracted period, weeks, months, possibly even years.
It could come off a tramp steamer just outside the international waters on our East Coast. A nuclear weapon that a terrorist could buy or build, steal, put on top of a missile that's easily bought today on the open arms market, and detonated over Pittsburgh, for example, at 100 kilometers, would expose over 1.5 million square miles of the United States, all the way from Boston to New York, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and even down to Knoxville, Tennessee.
When we try to devise a way to defend ourselves from the enemy's weapons, we must first look at the will of the enemy and then the enemy's capacity to carry out their malevolent goal. It's been made perfectly clear that the Iranian government wants, at the very least, to take out the United States as a leading world power, and at worst, it wants to bring an end to Western civilization as we know it.
There is nothing we can do to hasten the return of Jesus in Christianity and the Messiah in Judaism. However, in Islam, the Shiites believe they can actively participate in preparing his way by creating a world catastrophe according to their teachings. The mullahs in Iran believe they are the appointed ones to make this happen.
U.S. military and law enforcement have the weapons, and countries are now not only weaponizing, but we believe are in an arms race using this technology in the last few years. Well, if they're in an arms race, you know it's effective, number one, and number two, it's going to get into the wrong hands sooner or later.
I'm going to talk about the societal impacts from what I call an extreme geomagnetic storm. People will say, well, nobody's going to do attack us with an EMP attack. They can't make that same statement about natural events.
A lot of the focus has been focused on, well, we need to be prepared for the peak of the sunspot cycle. In actuality, large storms can and do occur at any time during the sunspot cycle. They're almost as probable of occurring in the next month as they are in the upcoming peak of the next solar cycle, which will be around 2012, 2013.
There are relays that operate inside of substations that are not manned. If those relays do not operate properly, you've got big problems. The transformers are not protected from the surges as the network goes down.
Today's military rely on commercial electric power in order for any of its forces outside of its strategic forces to function. Without electric power, troops can't move, aircraft cannot deliver supplies, equipment can't even be fueled. Battlefield communications, the trump card for the American fighting forces, would become non-existent.
In our view, the modern society is characterized by the presence of three things: clean available water, properly functioning sewage and sanitation services, and electricity. And I would further assert that because the first two systems rely on electricity to function, we really at base need electricity to have a modern society.
The trend in this country is toward ever more sophisticated electronic systems. The increasing dependence of the United States on an electronic economy increases the vulnerability of the banking and financial infrastructure to the effects of electromagnetic pulse.
There's really no excuse for the country to be vulnerable to EMP. There are solutions to this threat. In fact, the EMP Commission came up with a plan that could be implemented quickly and at relatively low cost. And there are even things that individuals can and should be doing to protect themselves and their families from EMP. And I would urge the American people not to wait on Washington to implement solutions, but to act now to do the simple things that could be done to protect yourselves and your family, to write your congressmen and your senators, to get Washington to act. Because the only thing that's lacking right now is political will at all levels of government to follow the EMP Commission recommendations to protect the American people.
Given the severity of the consequences from an EMP attack, any federal response will be fairly meaningless to state and local governments because the federal government's going to be entirely focused on continuity of government issues. They're not going to have the resources nor the time to be kind of out there into the communities as you would, let's say, President issues a FEMA declaration and out comes all these federal resources. That's just not going to happen.
Can you imagine an EMP event where you call 911 and no one's coming because they don't have the capability, the communications capability, the resources to be able to effectively deploy to your region or your area?
Drawing attention to a national issue that frankly would not be understood by very many people absent a conference like this. When people would say electromagnetic pulse, I suspect people's eyes glaze over. But if we don't educate them, where do we go on this? And frankly speaking, we are not prepared as a nation to face the threat of EMP at any level of government.
We're not ready. We're just plain not ready. Whether it's a natural event from the sun or whether it's an event that's created by a nuclear blast or even another form of EMP, we're not ready.
We've heard a lot about bringing it to the attention of government. They had several meetings with congressmen, county executives and such, and when Mike Nolan goes in alone, it usually doesn't mean a whole lot. But when he walks in with 50 other supervisors or 100 other mayors, our federal officials begin to listen.
How are we going to get this information out to a public that is resistant to hear it? It's going to be very challenging, and my hope is that this meeting will be the beginning of some serious thought on how we do this, because it can be done.
With appropriate technical actions, worst-case EMP effects can be somewhat, if not substantially, mitigated. It takes focused leadership, some resources, but most of all, coordinated actions across the Congress, the industries that are involved here, and in particular, I think getting first-tier industries involved, incentivized and resourced, and especially the executive branch departments to achieve real and substantial actions on mitigating and hardening.
One of the brilliant things we have is we have a stimulus package that's passed. The money's there. The amount of money we're talking about, $4 to $5 billion, is what America spends at the movies on weekends in a year and a half. I think we can afford it.
But then there's a good news story here. Because Peter's work and the Commission's work, they've come up with a series of recommendations. So we know what to do. We know what we can do, and we can do it together.
Many of these people, former CIA directors, former directors of the Defense Nuclear Agency, EMP commissioners, the foremost scientific experts on EMP phenomenology in the world, went to Niagara Falls to speak directly to the American people because they were so frustrated that Washington hasn't been listening.
This little effort that we were trying blossomed to where 700 people came. Everybody paid attention and were impressed. And I understand from Peter that many people in Washington were affected by this.
It has had a powerful impact. The fact of that conference has attracted an unprecedented amount of media attention to the EMP threat. And it gave hope to those in Congress who've been fighting an uphill battle and has carried us actually to the threshold of victory. Never before has there been so much public knowledge of EMP and determination to do something about it in the halls of Congress.
Think about what you personally can do to help save our country and civilization from the train that is surely coming down the tracks.